Now what if I told you those footsteps might not have been human? At least not human the way we think of it. Not Homo sapiens, not us. What if something else got here first? If you're settling in for sleep right now, perfect. That's exactly what this is for. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing the comments roll in. Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all of us drifting through the same story together across different moments in time. For over half a century, we had the story of the Americas figured out. We knew when people arrived, how they got here, what route they took. It was settled science, textbook material, the kind of thing you could confidently tell your kids without any caveats or maybes. Then we started digging deeper, literally, under parking lots in California, in the white gypsum dunes of New Mexico, along the beaches of San Diego, in caves carved into Brazilian rock. Scientists found things that shouldn't exist, evidence that shattered every timeline we'd constructed, footprints that predated the supposed arrival by over 10,000 years, bones with marks that looked disturbingly like tool scratches, dated to 130,000 years ago, stone tools in caves that pushed human presence back to times when Homo sapiens hadn't even left Africa yet. The establishment fought back hard. Careers were staked on the old timeline. Papers were rejected. Researchers were ridiculed. But the evidence kept piling up. Site after site, discovery after discovery, each one screaming the same impossible message. Someone was here long before we thought possible. And here's where it gets weird. Really weird. The dating on some of these sites puts them in periods when we know for certain that modern humans were still confined to Africa and parts of Eurasia. They hadn't reached the Americas yet. They couldn't have. The timing doesn't work. So who left those marks? Who made those tools? Who walked across those ancient mudflats, leaving footprints that would fossilize into questions we still can't fully answer? The answer might be hiding in plain sight, written in the bones of species we've only recently begun to understand. Denisovans, Homo erectus, maybe even others we haven't discovered yet. Species of humans that weren't quite us, but were human enough to cross oceans, survive ice ages, and leave traces so subtle we almost missed them entirely. Think about what we're really talking about here. A timeline that doesn't stretch back 13,000 years, but potentially 130,000 years or more. That's not a minor revision. That's a complete rewrite of American prehistory. That's putting human activity in the Americas back into periods when Neanderthals still walked Europe, when our own ancestors in Africa were just beginning to develop the traits that would make them us. The implications are staggering. It means ice ages came and went with human populations in the Americas we never knew existed. It means migrations we never imagined. It means technologies and adaptations that somehow left almost no trace. Ghost populations moving through a ghost history, invisible to us until very recently, and the mystery goes deeper still. Because if other human species made it to the Americas tens of thousands of years before us, what happened to them? Where did they go? Did they die out before we arrived? Or did they linger, watching from the shadows as Homo sapiens finally crossed that same land bridge millennia later? Some researchers think they might have encountered the first modern humans to arrive. That somewhere, sometime, two different human species met in the ancient Americas. If that happened, we have no record of it. No stories, no cave paintings, no evidence beyond ambiguous stone tools and mysterious dates that don't quite line up. What we're about to explore isn't just a story about who got to America first. It's a story about the limits of what we can know about our own past, about the humility required to overturn decades of accepted truth, about following evidence even when it leads somewhere that seems impossible. We're going on a journey through hundreds of thousands of years, across ice ages and lost continents, through the fossil record and the genetic code, chasing shadows of beings who are human, but not quite us. Species we shared this planet with. Species who might have stood on American shores watching the same oceans we watch today. Thinking thoughts we'll never fully understand. The ground beneath your feet has secrets, and we're just beginning to learn how to read them. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology had a clean, simple answer to the question of who first arrived in the Americas. The story went like this. Around 13,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, humans crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska. They walked through an ice-free corridor between two massive glaciers, emerged into the heartland of North America, and found themselves in a paradise unlike anything their ancestors had ever seen. Vast grasslands stretching to the horizon, herds of mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths so enormous they made modern elephants look small. Saber-toothed cats prowling through forests of trees that would never be logged. Rivers thick with fish that had never seen a human fishing line, and not a single other human to compete with. The entire Western Hemisphere, 2 continents worth of territory, completely empty and waiting to be claimed. These first Americans, according to the theory, were sophisticated big-game hunters. They carried distinctive spear points, beautifully crafted stone tools with a characteristic fluted base that made them easy to attach to wooden shafts. These points were found at a site near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1920s and 30s, and they became the signature artifact of the first Americans, the Clovis people. The story was compelling. Archaeological evidence showed these Clovis points spreading across North America with remarkable speed. Within just 500 years, maybe less, sites with Clovis technology appeared from coast to coast, from Canada to Mexico. That's explosive, unprecedented expansion. It suggested a population boom of staggering proportions, small bands of hunters multiplying and spreading like wildfire across virgin territory. And wherever the Clovis points appeared, megafauna started disappearing. Mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers the size of bears, massive ground sloths. All extinct within a few thousand years of human arrival. The correlation seemed obvious. These weren't peaceful gatherers carefully managing resources. These were apex predators so efficient at killing that they hunted dozens of species into oblivion. The Clovis first model became more than just a theory. It became the foundation of American archaeology. Textbooks taught it. Museums displayed it. Career archaeologists built their reputations defending it. By the 1960s and 70s, it had achieved something rare in science: consensus. Not unanimous agreement, but close enough that challenging it could derail an academic career. Here's why the theory was so appealing. First, it was simple. One migration, one route, one distinct cultural group. No messy complications. No multiple waves of different peoples arriving at different times. Just a clean, linear narrative that anyone could understand. Second, it fit perfectly with the geological evidence available at the time. During the last ice age, sea levels were lower. A land bridge called Beringia really did connect Siberia and Alaska. And around 13,000 years ago, the massive ice sheets covering Canada really did begin to separate, creating a potential migration corridor. The timing seemed to line up perfectly. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Clovis points themselves were undeniably impressive. These weren't crude stone choppers or simple scrapers. These were works of art. Each point required dozens, sometimes hundreds of precisely placed strikes to shape. The fluting, those distinctive channels running up both sides of the base, was especially difficult. One mistake and the entire piece could shatter. You had to understand stone mechanics at an intuitive level, had to be able to read the grain and predict how force would propagate through the material. Holding a Clovis point today, you can still feel the skill that went into making it. The edges are sharp enough to shave with. The symmetry is often perfect. The craftsmanship rivals anything produced by Stone Age peoples anywhere in the world. These were made by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who had refined their technique over many generations. The theory painted a vivid picture. Small bands of hunters, maybe 20 or 30 individuals per group, moving constantly across the landscape, tracking mammoth herds, following seasonal migrations, setting up temporary camps near water sources. The men would have been powerful, experienced hunters who understood animal behavior intimately. The women would have been processing meat and hides, gathering plant foods, keeping children alive in a dangerous world. Life would have been hard but rewarding. Plenty of food when hunts were successful, hunger and hardship when they weren't. They would have passed down knowledge through oral tradition, how to read animal tracks, where to find good stone for tool making, which plants were edible, which were poisonous, how to survive winter, how to deliver babies, how to treat injuries and infections, every generation building on the knowledge of the previous one, gradually accumulating the wisdom needed to thrive in a new world. As populations grew, groups would split, some heading south following the retreating ice, others pushing west toward the Pacific coast, still others moving east into the forests and river valleys of what would become the eastern United States. Within a few centuries, according to the model, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, having traversed both continents with astonishing speed. The Clovis consensus became so entrenched that it developed its own defensive mechanisms. When archaeologists found sites that seemed older than 13,000 years, the response was often skeptical, sometimes hostile. The burden of proof for pre-Clovis sites became extraordinarily high. You needed perfect stratigraphy, unambiguous dating, undeniable artifacts. Anything less was dismissed as contaminated, misinterpreted, or simply wrong. This wasn't necessarily bad science. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence. And there were legitimate concerns about dating methods in the mid-20th century. Radiocarbon dating was still relatively new. Contamination was a real problem. Archaeological techniques were less refined than they are today, so some skepticism was warranted. But skepticism gradually hardened into dogma. The Clovis first model became the null hypothesis that had to be disproven rather than a theory that needed testing. Young archaeologists learned not to waste time looking for pre-Clovis sites. Funding agencies didn't want to support research that challenged the consensus. Academic journals were reluctant to publish findings that contradicted established timelines. For decades, this worked. The Clovis first model stood unchallenged, not because the evidence for it was overwhelming, but because the system had become resistant to alternatives. It was a comfortable consensus, a shared understanding that let archaeologists focus on other questions without constantly relitigating the basics. But science has a way of correcting itself. Eventually the weight of contrary evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. New technologies reveal things that old methods couldn't detect. Young researchers, unburdened by career investments in existing theories, start asking uncomfortable questions, and slowly, inevitably, the comfortable consensus begins to crack. By the 1980s and 90s, those cracks were appearing. Not huge, obvious fractures, but small fissures that suggested maybe, just maybe, the story was more complicated than anyone had thought. Sites in South America that seemed impossibly old. Genetic studies that didn't quite match the archaeological timeline. New dating techniques that challenged assumptions about when humans could have arrived. The defenders of Clovis first didn't give up easily. Each challenge was met with rigorous scrutiny and often legitimate criticism. But each challenge also made it a little harder to maintain certainty, a little more difficult to dismiss alternatives out of hand. The revolution was coming. The Clovis consensus was about to collapse, and when it did, it would reveal a story far stranger and more fascinating than anyone had imagined. For decades, the story seemed settled. Clovis people arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, spread rapidly across 2 continents, and became the ancestors of all Native American populations. The evidence was clear, the dates were consistent, and the theory was taught in every textbook. Archaeological sites older than Clovis simply didn't exist, or so everyone believed. But then came Monteverde. Deep in southern Chile, nearly 10,000 miles from the Bering Land Bridge, archaeologist Tom Dillehay spent years excavating a site along a creek that would shatter the Clovis consensus. What made Monteverde extraordinary wasn't just its age, though that would prove controversial enough. It was the preservation. Most archaeological sites give us stone tools, bones, maybe some charcoal from ancient fires. The organic materials, the things that tell us how people actually lived. Those decay within years or decades, leaving almost no trace. Monteverde was different. Around 14,500 years ago, the site had been covered by a peat bog, creating an oxygen-free environment that preserved everything. And I mean everything. Dillehay's team found wooden tools, plant remains, pieces of hide, even chunks of mastodon meat with bite marks still visible. They found the remains of wooden structures, frameworks of logs and planks that had once formed simple dwellings. They found grinding stones with microscopic traces of wild potatoes still clinging to them. They found braided rope made from plant fibers. They found hearths with identifiable plant species, showing exactly what people had been eating 14,500 years ago. This wasn't just an archaeological site. It was a time capsule, a frozen moment from an age when humans supposedly weren't even in the Americas yet. And the radiocarbon dates were unambiguous. 14,500 years old, a full 1,500 years before Clovis. The response from the archaeological community was swift and brutal. Monteverde became the most controversial site in American archaeology. Critics argued the dates must be wrong, that the organic materials must have been contaminated by more recent carbon. They questioned Dillehay's excavation methods, his interpretations, even his professional competence. For years the site was dismissed, marginalized, treated as an aberration that somehow didn't count. The resistance wasn't just academic nitpicking. The Clovis model had become orthodoxy, and orthodoxy doesn't die easily. Too many careers had been built on it, too many papers published assuming its correctness. More than that, it offered a clean, simple story. Humans crossed the land bridge, invented a superior tool technology, and conquered 2 empty continents in a few centuries. Neat, dramatic, easy to teach. Monteverde threatened all of that. If humans were in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they must have entered the Americas much earlier, maybe thousands of years earlier. The simple story of rapid conquest gave way to something messier, more complex, harder to pin down. Many archaeologists simply didn't want to deal with the implications. But Dillehay persisted. In 1997, he invited a group of prominent archaeologists to visit Monteverde and examine the evidence firsthand. They spent days at the site, looking at the stratigraphy, examining the artifacts, reviewing the dating evidence. One by one, the skeptics became convinced. The dates were solid. The artifacts were genuine. Monteverde was real, and it was older than Clovis. The consensus began to crack. But Monteverde wasn't alone. As archaeologists started looking more carefully at sites they'd previously dismissed, other candidates for pre-Clovis occupation began emerging from the shadows. One of the most intriguing was Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. Archaeologist James Adovasio had been excavating Meadowcroft since the 1970s, and from the beginning he'd been getting dates that seemed too old. Not just a little too old, but dramatically too old. Some layers appeared to be 16,000 years old, maybe older, thousands of years before Clovis. The site itself was impressive, a massive rock overhang that had provided shelter for humans over thousands of years. The stratigraphy was textbook perfect, clear layers stacked one atop another like pages in a book, each representing a different period of occupation. The lowest levels, the ones yielding the oldest dates, contained simple stone tools, charcoal from ancient fires, and the bones of animals humans had hunted and butchered. But the dates were too early, so the archaeological establishment found reasons to dismiss them. Maybe the charcoal samples had been contaminated by ancient coal deposits in the region, making them appear older than they really were. Maybe the stratigraphy had been disturbed by rodent burrows or groundwater, mixing materials from different time periods. Maybe Adovasio had simply made mistakes in his excavation or analysis. The criticism went on for decades. Papers were written questioning every aspect of Meadowcroft's chronology. Conference presentations became battlegrounds where Adovasio defended his findings against waves of skeptics. For years, Meadowcroft existed in a kind of archaeological limbo, too well documented to dismiss entirely, but too controversial to accept. Then Monteverde was validated, and suddenly Meadowcroft didn't seem so impossible anymore. Other archaeologists began re-examining the evidence with fresh eyes. The contamination arguments didn't hold up under scrutiny. Multiple dating methods yielded consistent results. The stratigraphy showed no signs of disturbance. Slowly, grudgingly, the consensus began to shift. Maybe Meadowcroft really was 16,000 years old. Maybe humans had been in North America far earlier than anyone wanted to believe. And if Meadowcroft was legitimate, what about all the other sites that had been dismissed over the years? What about Cactus Hill in Virginia, with its pre-Clovis layer buried beneath classic Clovis tools? What about the Topper site in South Carolina, where archaeologist Al Goodyear claimed to have found artifacts dating back 50,000 years? What about Page Ladson in Florida, where stone tools had been found alongside mastodon bones in layers dating to 14,500 years ago? One by one, these sites began receiving serious attention. Not all of them held up. Some really did have problems with their dates or their stratigraphic contexts, but enough of them proved genuine that the pattern became undeniable. Humans had been in the Americas before Clovis, probably thousands of years before. The simple story was wrong. But here's what made the transition so difficult. It wasn't just about accepting new dates. It was about rethinking everything. If humans arrived before the ice-free corridor opened, they must have come by a different route, probably along the Pacific coast. But most of the ancient coastline is now underwater, drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, making that evidence almost impossible to find. If they arrived earlier than 13,000 years ago, they must have been here during the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the Ice Age, when massive glaciers covered much of North America. What kind of technology would have allowed them to survive in such harsh conditions? If they didn't have Clovis points, what tools were they using, and why are those earlier tools so hard to identify? Every answered question spawned 5 new ones. The neat story dissolved into complexity and uncertainty. Archaeological conferences that used to focus on the details of Clovis culture now became debates about fundamental questions. When did humans first arrive? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Were there multiple migrations or just one? Did they come by land, by sea, or both? The old guard resisted every step. Some prominent archaeologists continued insisting that Clovis had to be first, that the pre-Clovis sites must be explained away somehow. They wrote papers arguing that dates from Monteverde and similar sites should be interpreted differently, or that the artifacts weren't really tools but natural rocks that just happened to look like tools, or that the sites had been contaminated in ways nobody had yet identified. But the evidence kept accumulating. By the early 2000s, even the most dedicated Clovis first advocates were starting to concede that humans had probably arrived by at least 15,000 years ago. The question shifted from were there pre-Clovis people to how much earlier did they arrive? 16,000 years, 20,000, even earlier? Each new site pushed the boundaries a little further back. Paisley Caves in Oregon yielded human coprolites, fossilized feces, dating to 14,300 years ago. The DNA extracted from them matched modern Native American populations, proving these really were human remains and not some kind of contamination. The Gault site in Texas produced thousands of tools from layers beneath the Clovis occupation, some potentially dating back 20,000 years. Cheeky Hewitt Cave in Mexico produced what might be stone tools dating back more than 30,000 years, though that site remains intensely controversial. The timeline kept stretching, the certainty kept eroding, and the story kept getting stranger. Because here's the thing that started bothering archaeologists. If humans had been in the Americas for 15,000 or 20,000, or maybe even 30,000 years, where were all their sites? Why weren't there thousands of pre-Clovis locations scattered across the landscape? Why did these earlier peoples leave so little trace of their existence? Some archaeologists suggested the pre-Clovis population must have been tiny. Just a few thousand people scattered across 2 continents, living so lightly on the land that they barely left any archaeological signature. Others proposed that rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age had drowned most early sites along the coasts, where people probably concentrated. Still others wondered if the earlier peoples used technologies that were almost invisible to archaeologists, tools made primarily from wood, bone, and plant materials that rarely survive in the archaeological record. But as researchers grappled with these questions, a few were starting to ask something even more radical. What if some of these sites weren't just older than Clovis? What if they were old enough that they couldn't have been made by modern humans at all? What if whoever created them arrived in the Americas when our species was still confined to Africa and Eurasia? What if the first Americans were something else entirely, something we hadn't even considered? That's when things got really weird. Picture a typical Southern California morning in 1992. Construction crews are widening State Route 54 in San Diego, excavators tearing through dirt and rock like they've done 1,000 times before. Nobody expects anything unusual. This is routine highway expansion, the kind of project that happens everywhere, all the time. Then the backhoe hits something, not rock, something different. The operator stops, calls over the supervisor. They peer into the trench and see what looks like enormous bones, far larger than anything from a cow or horse. The construction stops. Calls are made. Within hours, paleontologists from the San Diego Natural History Museum arrive on site. What they find stops them cold. Mastodon bones. Huge, ancient, unmistakable. These elephant relatives roamed North America during the Ice Age, and finding their remains isn't particularly rare in Southern California. Museums have plenty of mastodon skeletons. This should have been a routine fossil recovery. Document everything, carefully extract the bones, add them to the collection, maybe put them on display. Instead, this site would become one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries in American history. The paleontologists set up a proper excavation. Over the following weeks, they carefully exposed and documented the remains. One mastodon, its bones scattered across a small area, broken and fragmentary. But as they worked, they started noticing things that didn't quite fit the pattern of a normal fossil site. The bones weren't just broken, they were broken in specific ways. Long bones smashed at particular angles, impact points showing characteristic patterns, spiral fractures, the kind you get when you break fresh bone, not fossilized bone. And then there were the rocks, 5 large stone cobbles, each weighing several pounds scattered among the bones. Not unusual rocks for the area, but oddly concentrated in this one spot. More strange, several of these stones showed what looked like damage patterns, impact scars, crushing marks, the kind of wear you might see on stones that had been used as tools, as hammers or anvils. The team documented everything meticulously, photographed every bone and stone in place, recorded the exact positions and relationships. Then they carefully removed the materials and transported them to the museum for analysis. And then, because this was just a fossil site, nothing more, the materials went into storage. For 25 years, the Cerutti Mastodon site, named after the paleontologist who directed the excavation, sat in museum drawers, largely forgotten. Just another Ice Age animal that had died near what would eventually become San Diego. But some of the scientists who had worked on the excavation couldn't quite shake what they'd seen. Those broken bones, those positioned stones, the patterns nagged at them. Finally, in the 2000s, a team led by paleontologist Steve Holan decided to take another look. They wanted to date the site properly, using modern techniques that hadn't been available in 1992. They selected pieces of mastodon bone and tusk and sent them to specialists for uranium-thorium dating, a method that's extremely reliable for materials in this age range. The results came back. The scientists checked them, rechecked them, sent additional samples to different labs. Every test confirmed the same age, 130,000 years old, plus or minus 9,000 years. The bones had lain in that spot for 130 millennia. Now, here's why this date made the scientific world lose its collective mind. 130,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, our species, had barely evolved in Africa. We weren't modern yet, not behaviourally, not culturally, and we definitely, absolutely, certainly hadn't reached the Americas. The earliest accepted evidence for humans anywhere near North America at that time was, well, non-existent. The whole debate about who the first Americans were had been focused on dates between 15,000 and maybe, possibly 30,000 years ago. Those dates were controversial enough. But 130,000 years? That wasn't just pushing back the timeline, that was shattering it completely. Unless, of course, the stones and broken bones weren't evidence of human activity at all. Maybe the mastodon just died naturally, and rocks happened to be nearby. Maybe the bones were broken by geological processes, by the weight of sediment pressing down over tens of thousands of years. This was the reasonable, measured scientific response. But Holan and his team didn't think so. They'd spent years studying how bones break under different circumstances. They knew what natural breaks looked like versus intentional breaks. And when they examined the Cerutti Mastodon bones under magnification, they saw patterns that matched experimental archaeology studies perfectly. When you want to extract marrow from a large animal bone, you don't need sophisticated tools. You just need heavy rocks and the knowledge of where to strike. Place the bone on an anvil stone, hit it at the right angle with a hammer stone, and the bone splits open. Spiral fractures radiating from the impact point. Do this right, and you get access to rich, fatty marrow, one of the most nutritious foods available to any Ice Age human. The Cerutti bones showed exactly these patterns. Spiral fractures radiating from specific impact points. Bone fragments with characteristic crushing marks. Impact notches on both the bones and several of the stones perfectly aligned with each other. To test their hypothesis, the team conducted experiments. They obtained fresh elephant bones, the closest modern equivalent to mastodon remains. They broke them using only unmodified stones, the same kind of cobbles found at the site. The experimental breaks matched the ancient breaks almost exactly. Same spiral fracture patterns, same impact angles, same distribution of fragments. They published their findings in 2017 in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The paper was careful, measured, presenting evidence without claiming absolute certainty. But the implications were clear. If the Cerutti site really was an archaeological site, if those bones really had been processed by intelligent beings, then someone had been in North America 130,000 years ago. Someone capable of breaking bones to extract marrow. Someone who knew where to find food during the Ice Age. But if it was humans, it wasn't us, not Homo sapiens. We were still in Africa, which meant it had to be one of the other human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, some unknown hominin we haven't even identified yet. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. The scientific community erupted. Some researchers found the evidence compelling, the bone fracture patterns convincing, the experimental archaeology solid. But many, probably most, remained deeply skeptical. The problem wasn't just the date, though that was shocking enough. The problem was the complete absence of any supporting evidence. No stone tools at the site, just possible hammer stones. No other archaeological sites from anywhere near this time period in the Americas. No genetic evidence for any human presence in North America before about 20,000 years ago. No fossil evidence for any hominin species crossing from Asia into Alaska during this period. If someone had been in San Diego 130,000 years ago, where did they come from? How did they get there? And where did they go? Did they just disappear, leaving only this single site as evidence? That seemed unlikely, almost impossible. Large mammals don't just visit continents and leave no trace except one butchery site. Critics argued that the bone fractures could be natural, that the team was seeing patterns that weren't really there. Heavy rocks rolling down slopes during floods or landslides can break bones. Geological pressure over tens of thousands of years can create fractures that look intentional. The fact that the bones and stones were found together might be purely coincidental. After all, rocks exist everywhere. Finding them near bones doesn't automatically mean they were used as tools. Some critics went further, questioning the dating itself. Though uranium-thorium dating is reliable, could there have been contamination? Could the samples have been compromised somehow? The original excavation in 1992 had used construction equipment, not the careful techniques of a modern archaeological dig. Maybe something had gone wrong that nobody had noticed. Holan and his colleagues defended their work, pointing to the multiple lines of evidence all pointing the same direction. The specific patterns of bone breakage, the positioning of stones relative to bones, the impact marks, the experimental replication. None of this proved beyond doubt that humans had been there, but it raised questions that couldn't be easily dismissed. The debate continues today, fierce and unresolved. Most archaeologists remain skeptical of the Cerutti site, filing it under interesting but not convincing. The extraordinary nature of the claim requires extraordinary evidence, and for many scientists the evidence just isn't strong enough yet. But a minority of researchers think the site deserves serious consideration. They point out that scientific consensus has been wrong before, that sites now accepted as genuine were once dismissed as impossible. What makes the Cerutti Mastodon so unsettling isn't just what it might mean if it's real. It's what it reveals about the limits of our knowledge. We've built our entire understanding of American prehistory on the assumption that humans arrived relatively recently, within the last 15,000 to 30,000 years. Every model, every theory, every interpretation depends on this framework. But what if the framework is wrong? What if our species isn't the only one that made it to the Americas? What if there were earlier migrations, earlier attempts at colonization that failed, leaving only scattered traces we haven't learned to recognize yet? The Cerutti site forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. Maybe there are other sites out there, other pieces of evidence that we've dismissed because they don't fit our expectations. Maybe we've been looking for the wrong things, expecting stone tools and hearths and clearly human fossils, when the real evidence is subtler, harder to interpret. Or maybe Cerutti really is just a broken mastodon skeleton, rocks nearby by coincidence, and all the pattern recognition is just our brains doing what they do best, finding meaning in randomness. The truth is, we don't know, and that uncertainty, that gap in our knowledge stretching back 130,000 years into the California dirt, that's what makes archaeology both frustrating and fascinating. Every answer creates new questions. Every discovery challenges what we thought we knew, and sometimes the most interesting sights are the ones we can't quite figure out, the puzzles that remain unsolved even after years of study. The Cerutti Mastodon sits in that liminal space between accepted and rejected, between possible and impossible, waiting for new evidence that might finally resolve the debate one way or another. Here's where the story gets really strange. We've been talking about ancient humans in the Americas, assuming that if anyone got here before us, it was human. But what if we've been asking the wrong question? What if the first beings to reach the Americas weren't Homo sapiens at all? You have to understand something about our family tree. For most of human history, we weren't alone. Earth wasn't the home of one human species. It was home to many. At various points in our past, the planet hosted a whole diverse family of human relatives, each adapted to different environments, each with their own survival strategies, each capable of sophisticated thought and culture. We're the only ones left now, the sole survivors of what was once a rich biological diversity. But for millions of years, humanity was plural, not singular, and some of these other humans were remarkable travellers, creatures who spread across continents long before Homo sapiens even existed. Let's start with the greatest wanderer of them all, Homo erectus. These were the first truly cosmopolitan humans. They evolved in Africa around 2 million years ago, and unlike their predecessors who stayed close to home, Homo erectus went everywhere. Within a few 100,000 years of their emergence, they'd reached Georgia in the Caucasus, Indonesia, and China. They were the first humans to systematically use fire, the first to develop standardized stone tool industries, the first to hunt large game cooperatively, and they were survivors. Homo erectus lasted as a species for nearly 2 million years. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 million years. Homo sapiens has existed for maybe 300,000 years. We're evolutionary newcomers compared to erectus. They saw ice ages come and go. They watched species rise and fall. They adapted to tropical rainforests, temperate woodlands, and cold steppes. If any human species had the time, the adaptability, and the wanderlust to reach the Americas, it was them. But there's a problem. We have no hard evidence they made it. No Homo erectus bones in the Americas, no tools that definitively match their technology, which means either they never arrived or their traces are so sparse, so weathered by time that we haven't found them yet. When you're looking for evidence that's potentially over 1 million years old, absence of evidence becomes a very tricky thing to interpret. Then there are the Denisovans. These mysterious cousins are one of the strangest chapters in human history because we barely know what they looked like. We have a few bone fragments, some teeth, and that's essentially it. Almost everything we know about Denisovans comes from DNA. Genetic material recovered from a cave in Siberia and from the genomes of living people across Asia and Oceania who carry Denisovan ancestry. But what we've learned from that DNA is astonishing. Denisovans were widespread, more widespread than we'd initially thought possible. They ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia, adapting to radically different environments along the way. Some populations developed genetic variants that help process oxygen at high altitudes. These same variants appear in modern Tibetan populations, evidence that ancient humans interbred with Denisovans and inherited survival genes that are still functioning today, still helping people thrive in thin mountain air. Other Denisovan populations show evidence of maritime adaptation. They somehow reached islands in Southeast Asia that required crossing significant water barriers. This is profound, because it means Denisovans had developed seafaring capabilities. They could build watercraft sophisticated enough to cross ocean channels, and they had the navigation skills to reach distant shores. Now, if Denisovans could cross water barriers in Southeast Asia, could they have crossed the Pacific? It's a massive leap, both literally and intellectually. The Pacific is vastly larger than any channel in Indonesia. But the possibility nags at researchers, because the alternative is to believe that Denisovans developed maritime technology and then conveniently stopped before attempting longer voyages. Humans don't usually work that way. Once we develop a capability, we tend to push it to its limits. The genetic evidence also tells us something else remarkable. Denisovans didn't just interbreed with Homo sapiens. They interbred with other human species too, including populations we haven't even identified yet. The Denisovan genome contains DNA from what geneticists call ghost populations, human groups that left no fossils but survive as genetic echoes in Denisovan DNA. This suggests the human family tree during the Pleistocene was incredibly complex, with multiple species overlapping, interbreeding, exchanging genes and probably cultural knowledge. And then there are the Neanderthals, our closest relatives, the human species we know best and understand most deeply. For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals dominated Europe and Western Asia. They weren't primitive or brutish, despite their reputation. They were sophisticated hunters with complex tools, symbolic thinking, and cultural practices that rivaled anything early Homo sapiens were doing. Neanderthals buried their dead with apparent ritual significance. They created art, wearing jewelry made from eagle talons and painting symbols in caves. They had language, almost certainly. The structure of their vocal anatomy and the complexity of their culture both argue for sophisticated verbal communication. Some researchers even think they might have had music, based on a bone flute found in a Neanderthal site in Slovenia. They were also remarkably adaptable. Neanderthal populations thrived in environments ranging from Mediterranean woodlands to Arctic tundra. They developed cold weather adaptations, robust physiques, and enlarged nasal passages that would have helped them survive brutal Ice Age winters. But they also showed up in the Middle East during warmer periods, suggesting they could handle temperature ranges that would challenge most modern humans. Could Neanderthals have reached the Americas? Geographically, they were in the right place. Neanderthals lived in Central Asia, not far from Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia and North America during Ice Age low sea levels. If they'd pushed just a bit further east, they would have encountered territory that led directly to the Americas, but again, we have no evidence they made that journey. No Neanderthal bones in Alaska or the Yukon, no distinctively Neanderthal tools anywhere in the Americas. Yet the genetics tells a more nuanced story. Modern Native American populations carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, just like all non-African humans do. This ancestry comes from interbreeding that happened in the Middle East around 60,000 years ago, before modern humans dispersed across the globe. But some researchers have suggested there might be additional, later episodes of Neanderthal gene flow into Asian populations that contributed to Native American ancestry. The data is ambiguous, difficult to interpret across such vast timescales, but it raises possibilities. Here's what we know for certain. Multiple human species had the cognitive capability, the technological sophistication, and the geographic range to potentially reach the Americas. Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years and spread across the Old World. Denisovans developed maritime technology and colonized remote islands. Neanderthals adapted to extreme environments and ranged across vast territories. All three species overlapped with early Homo sapiens, sometimes interbreeding, always competing, occasionally cooperating. And all three disappeared before recorded history, leaving behind only bones, stones and genetic traces in modern populations. The maritime question is particularly fascinating because it touches on something fundamental about human capability. For a long time, archaeologists assumed ancient humans couldn't cross significant water barriers. The ocean was seen as an impassable boundary, something that would have stopped human expansion until relatively recent times, when advanced boat building emerged. But the evidence keeps contradicting that assumption. Homo floresiensis, the tiny humans of Indonesia, lived on an island that was never connected to the mainland by land bridges. They had to have arrived by water, probably over 700,000 years ago. Denisovans reached islands requiring water crossings. Even some Homo erectus populations seem to have crossed water barriers that we'd assumed were impassable. This suggests that ancient humans, not just Homo sapiens but our older relatives too, were more capable mariners than we've given them credit for. Maybe they didn't have elaborate ships, but simple rafts or dugout canoes can be remarkably effective for coastal voyaging. And once you can travel along coasts, you can cover enormous distances, island hopping across the Pacific, following the Aleutian chain from Asia to North America. Even accidental voyages carried by storms and currents become possible. But here's the frustrating part. We have no skeletal evidence, none. If Homo erectus or Denisovans or Neanderthals reached the Americas, they left no bodies behind that we've found. And this absence is genuinely puzzling, because we've found their remains all across the Old World. Homo erectus bones show up from Africa to Java. Neanderthal skeletons are relatively common in European caves. Even Denisovans, despite their scarcity, have left traces in Siberia. So why nothing in the Americas? Several possibilities emerge. Maybe they never arrived and we're chasing ghosts. Maybe they did arrive, but in such small numbers that their bones are statistically invisible, scattered across a vast continent and dissolved by time. Maybe we've already found their remains but misidentified them, classified them as anomalous Homo sapiens because we weren't expecting anything else. Or maybe, and this is the most tantalizing possibility, their evidence is still out there, waiting in some unexplored cave or eroded riverbank, ready to rewrite everything we think we know about the peopling of the Americas. The human family tree was once vast and diverse. We're all that's left now, the final survivors of a once crowded world. But for millions of years humanity wore many faces, spoke different languages, solved problems in different ways. And some of those other humans were wanderers, explorers, survivors who pushed into every corner of the old world. The question isn't whether they could have reached the Americas. The question is whether they did, and whether we're looking in the right places with the right expectations to find the evidence they left behind. Now we need to talk about a place that no longer exists. A lost continent that isn't really lost, just drowned. A world that connected two hemispheres and made the peopling of the Americas possible. The place called Beringia. Forget the image of a narrow ice bridge that ancient people hurried across before it disappeared. That's not what Beringia was. During the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in massive glaciers covering North America and Europe that global sea levels dropped by 400 feet. 400 feet! That's enough to expose vast areas of what we now call the seafloor. Between Siberia and Alaska, this meant exposing an area the size of Texas and California combined. Not a bridge, a subcontinent, 1,000 miles from north to south, stretching from the Arctic Ocean down to the Aleutian Islands. This was Beringia, picture it. Not frozen wasteland, not barren tundra. The latest research using ancient pollen samples, fossil records and climate modelling paints a completely different picture. Beringia was an ecosystem, a cold one, yes, but incredibly productive. During peak glacial periods, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, Beringia remained largely ice-free. The climate was too dry for massive glaciers to form. Instead, you had what ecologists call mammoth steppe, a grassland ecosystem unlike anything that exists today. Imagine rolling plains covered with hardy grasses, sedges and flowering herbs. Not the endless grass of African savannas, but thick, nutritious vegetation adapted to cold, dry conditions. This wasn't accidental. The combination of cold temperatures, low precipitation, and constant grazing by massive herbivores created a unique ecological balance. The grasses grew short but dense, packed with nutrients. The cold preserved nutrients in the soil that would have been quickly depleted in warmer climates. And the animals. If you stood on those plains 20,000 years ago and looked around, you'd see herds that would make the Serengeti look empty. Woolly mammoths, not in small family groups, but in massive herds. Some paleontologists think mammoth populations in Beringia numbered in the millions. Alongside them, woolly rhinoceros, giant ground sloths, massive bison with horn spans reaching 6 feet. Horses, camels, ancient species we can barely imagine, because they have no modern descendants. Predators followed the herds. Short-faced bears, larger than any bear alive today, built for running down prey on open plains. Cave lions, bigger than modern African lions, perfectly adapted to cold weather hunting. Dire wolves working in packs to bring down juvenile mammoths. And somewhere among all this abundance, humans, or their predecessors, or maybe species we haven't even identified yet. But here's what makes Beringia so crucial to our story. It wasn't just a highway between continents. It was a place where people could live. For thousands of years, potentially. Sea levels don't drop overnight. The formation of Beringia happened gradually over centuries. And it didn't just appear once. Every ice age for the past 2 million years exposed at least part of this landmass. The bridge appeared and disappeared in cycles lasting thousands of years, following the rhythm of glacial advance and retreat. During warmer interglacial periods, sea levels rose and Beringia flooded, becoming the Bering Strait and Chukchi Sea we know today. During cold glacial periods, the waters retreated and the land bridge appeared again. This happened multiple times, maybe dozens of times, and every time it appeared it created an opportunity, a corridor between worlds. Now here's where things get really interesting. Geneticists studying the DNA of Native American populations have found something unexpected, a pattern that doesn't quite fit the simple story of people walking from Siberia to Alaska and then spreading south. The pattern suggests what scientists call the Beringian standstill hypothesis. Look at the genetic diversity in modern Native American populations, then compare it to the genetic diversity in Asian populations. Something happened. Some kind of population separation that lasted long enough to create a distinctive genetic signature. The best explanation. A group of ancestral Native Americans spent thousands of years isolated in Beringia itself. Picture this scenario. Around 25,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, a population of humans living in Northeast Asia followed the herds onto the exposed Beringia landmass. Maybe they were just hunting. Maybe they were expanding into new territory as populations grew. But then something happened. The glaciers to the south and east grew larger, creating massive ice sheets that blocked any movement further into the Americas. Meanwhile, behind them, climate shifts in Siberia might have made their former territories less hospitable. Or maybe other populations moved in, occupying the best hunting grounds. Whatever the reason, this group found themselves effectively trapped on Beringia. Not prisoners exactly. The land was productive enough to support them, but isolated. Cut off from other human populations by ice to the east, ocean to the north and west, and occupied territories or harsh conditions to the south. So they stayed. For 5,000 years, maybe longer, generation after generation, living on this now vanished continent. Small population, probably a few thousand individuals at most, enough to maintain genetic diversity, but small enough that genetic drift would have significant effects. they weren't just surviving, they were evolving, adapting to Beringian conditions, developing unique genetic variants, creating their own tool traditions, their own stories, their own identity. The genetic evidence suggests this population remained relatively isolated until around 15,000 years ago. Then something changed. Maybe an ice-free corridor opened between the massive Laurentide ice sheet covering eastern North America and the Cordilleran ice sheet covering the western mountains. Maybe climate warming made the coastal routes more accessible. Or maybe the Beringian population had simply grown large enough that groups began pushing into new territories regardless of the challenges. But the Beringian standstill is just one model. Other researchers look at the same genetic evidence and see something different. Multiple waves, not one migration but several, spread across thousands of years, each wave bringing a distinct population, each contributing different genetic signatures to modern Native Americans. Under this model, the first wave came earliest, maybe 20,000 or 25,000 years ago. These pioneers, whoever they were, managed to find a way through or around the ice. They spread rapidly through the Americas, becoming the ancestors of most Native American populations. Then came second wave, thousands of years later. These populations, possibly speaking different languages or using different technologies, moved into already occupied territories. Sometimes they mixed with existing populations. Sometimes they displaced them. Sometimes they occupied different ecological niches, living alongside earlier arrivals without much interaction. Maybe there was a third wave, or a fourth. The genetic data gets murky. Different research teams analysing different markers find different patterns. Some see 3 distinct migrations, others see 5. Still others argue for continuous low-level migration over tens of thousands of years, with no clear separation into distinct waves. And then there's the coastal route, the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Because here's a problem with all the interior routes. Whether through an ice-free corridor or across Beringia itself, the interior of Ice Age North America was brutal. Cold, dry, seasonal extremes, resources that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. Survival would have been desperately difficult. But the coasts were different. Even during maximum glaciation, the Pacific coast of North America supported rich marine ecosystems. Kelp forests stretching for thousands of miles filled with fish, seals, sea otters, shellfish, productive estuaries where rivers met the sea, predictable, abundant resources that didn't disappear in winter. Recent archaeological surveys using underwater robotics have found submerged sites along the Pacific coast that date back 13,000 years or more. These sites are now 100 feet underwater because sea levels have risen since the Ice Age ended. But they prove that people were living along the coast at least that long ago. And if there are sites at 100 feet depth, might there be older sites even deeper in areas we haven't surveyed yet? The Kelp Highway hypothesis suggests that maritime adapted populations could have moved down the Pacific coast from Beringia to California, Chile and beyond in just a few thousand years. Not walking across frozen tundra, but paddling boats from one rich coastal area to the next. Harvesting seafood, following the kelp forests, staying in the productive coastal zone where survival was relatively easy. This raises a fascinating possibility. What if different human species use different routes at different times? Modern humans taking the coastal route, following maritime resources. Neanderthals or Denisovans or some other archaic human taking interior routes during earlier glacial periods when conditions aligned just right. Different populations, different technologies, different strategies, all converging on the Americas from different directions at different times. The evidence for this is circumstantial but intriguing. Some stone tool technologies in the Americas look unlike anything found in Northeast Asia, but show similarities to tools from European Paleolithic sites. Explained as convergent evolution by most archaeologists, people independently inventing similar solutions to similar problems. But a few researchers wonder if there might be actual connections. Transatlantic migrations during earlier ice ages when conditions were different. Others point to dental patterns, skull measurements, even parasite DNA that suggests the first Americans might not have been a single homogeneous population, but a mixture of peoples from different source regions. As if multiple groups, using different routes, arrived at different times and mixed together to create the genetic diversity we see in ancient American remains. Beringia itself is now lost. The land bridge disappeared for the last time around 11,000 years ago as global temperatures rose and glaciers melted, releasing their water back into the oceans. The Bering Strait opened, the Mammoth Steppe flooded and became seafloor. Any archaeological sites from the Beringian standstill period, if they existed, now lie beneath 150 feet of cold, turbulent ocean water. We can't excavate them, can't study the tools those isolated populations made or the camps they built. We can only infer their existence from genetic shadows and mathematical models. But those shadows are real. Something happened in Beringia that left a permanent mark on the DNA of millions of people. Some population experienced some degree of isolation that was long enough and complete enough to create distinctive genetic patterns that persist to this day. Maybe someday underwater archaeology will reach those sites. Special submarines designed to excavate submerged Paleolithic remains. Imagine the first time someone brings up a stone tool from the floor of the Bering Strait. Proof that humans lived and worked on land that hasn't seen sunlight in 11,000 years. But for now, Beringia remains a ghost continent, a lost world that we know existed only because of its effects, like detecting a black hole by watching how it bends light from stars behind it. We can't see Beringia, but we can see what it did to the people who lived there, and what it means for understanding who the first Americans really were. Picture this. You're lying back in the dark, the desert night cold and silent around you. Above, the Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon, a river of ancient light. Around you, everything feels empty, ageless, as if nothing has ever really happened here. Now imagine the sun rising over a flat white landscape. Not sand exactly, but gypsum crystals ground so fine they look like snow. White Sands, New Mexico, one of the strangest deserts on Earth. Blindingly bright, wind-shaped into dunes that seem to flow like frozen waves. At first glance, it looks utterly lifeless. Just dunes, sky, and a distant mountain range. But under the right conditions, when the air is heavy and the ground is damp, the desert plays a trick. Shadows appear in the whiteness. Long looping trails like ghost handwriting stretching across the flats. Lines of darkened ovals, each about the length of your hand. Some are crisp, like they were made yesterday. Others are faint, half erased, like memories the earth is trying to forget. They're footprints, not fossil bones in a museum case, not chipped stone tools carefully labelled in drawers. Actual steps, the exact places where a heel pressed down, where toes pushed off. The weight of a body captured in wet mud, then buried, preserved, and finally revealed again 20,000 years later when the moisture is just right. Then, as the ground dries, they vanish. The contrast fades. The ghostwriting disappears, and the desert looks empty again. The past, hiding in plain sight. In 2021, a team of researchers announced something astonishing about those ghost tracks. They weren't just old, they were impossibly old. According to their dating, many of the footprints at White Sands formed between about 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, right in the middle of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets thousands of feet thick covered much of North America. A time when, according to the classic story, there shouldn't have been any humans that far south in the Americas at all. But the sand was telling a different story. To understand why this matters, you have to picture the world as it was then. Sea levels were far lower. Vast ice sheets smothered Canada, parts of the northern United States, and high mountains. The air was colder, drier. Glaciers flowed like slow rivers of stone, grinding down everything in their path. Between Siberia and Alaska, the Bering Land Bridge, Beringia, was exposed, a continent in its own right. Grasslands, rivers, herds of mammoths and bison. For decades, the standard model said humans crossed that bridge from Asia into Alaska sometime around 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, then waited for an ice-free corridor to open through the glaciers before moving south into the rest of the continent. According to that timeline, New Mexico shouldn't see human footprints until well after 14,000 years ago. But there they are, white sands, 21,000 to 23,000 years old if the dates are right. Footsteps in the middle of the supposed ice prison, as if someone had quietly slipped into the theatre years before the doors were supposed to unlock and taken a walk right through the middle of the stage. And it's not just one or two lonely prints, it's hundreds, thousands, layer after layer of them stacked in the lake sediments like pages in a book. Because back then, White Sands wasn't a desert. It was the edge of a shallow lake, a Pleistocene water body shimmering under a cooler sun, ringed with grasses and reeds. Mammoths came to drink there. Giant ground sloths lumbered along the shore. Ancient camels and dire wolves and now vanished birds left their own trails in the mud. Among them, sometimes crossing, sometimes weaving between the animal paths, are human tracks, and the most striking thing, many of them were made by children and teenagers. The scientists mapped out one particularly long trackway, a zigzag path of small footprints stretching for more than a mile along the ancient lakeshore. A teenager, maybe 12 or 13, walking with a determined, almost hurried stride. At one point the person slips slightly in the mud, then keeps going. Elsewhere, clusters of tiny prints swarm around a bigger one, a group of children moving with an adult darting in and out, moving close to the water, then back. You can almost see the scene, a cold, windy morning, shallow waves licking against the lake edge, the cries of birds, the distant rumble of mammoth herds, a teenager, perhaps carrying a baby on their hip for part of the walk, then putting them down, because in one trackway the stride changes, and the scientists notice small distortions that suggest extra weight being set down and picked up again. A child getting tired, a sibling shifting their burden from one arm to the other. These aren't heroic hunters frozen mid-spear throw. They're just people walking, kids exploring, parents doing chores by the water, ordinary life unfolding in a world we usually only imagine as a harsh Ice Age wilderness. Bones can tell you a species was there. Stone tools can tell you someone was doing something somewhere with some intention. But footprints tell you how a person moved, how fast they went, whether they were limping or carrying weight or turning their head to look at something. Footprints tell you someone was there, in that exact spot, at that exact moment, with the sun at a particular angle, the wind blowing off the lake, the mud just wet enough to hold their passing. It's hard to feel close to someone who lived 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, when all you have is a shattered femur and a flint scraper. But when you see their tracks, heel, arch, toes, you recognize them immediately. That's how your foot falls too. And suddenly, deep time doesn't feel so deep. Now, how do we know those White Sands footprints are as old as 21,000 to 23,000 years? They sit in layers of lake bed sediment that also contain seeds from a small freshwater plant called Ruppia serosa, ditch grass. Those seeds can be dated using radiocarbon methods. The researchers sampled seeds from just above and just below the footprint horizons, the dates clustered during the peak of the last glacial maximum. If those dates are accurate, it means humans were in the southern parts of North America not just a little bit earlier than the traditional Clovis first model allowed, but thousands of years earlier, long before the supposed opening of the ice-free corridor. That has enormous implications. If people were walking along a lake in what is now New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they probably hadn't just arrived the week before. Populations take time to move, adapt, and spread. That would strongly suggest humans entered the Americas earlier than 23,000 years ago, maybe 26,000, 30,000, or even more depending on which migration models you favour. Suddenly the front door of the continent, the ice-free corridor between the big ice sheets, starts to look less like the original entrance and more like a later highway, an opening that people might have used after they were already scattered far to the south. So how did they get there? One possibility is that long before the corridor opened, people had already moved along the Pacific coast, skirting the edge of the ice on land or by boat, using kelp forests, rocky shores and river mouths as stepping stones. A kelp highway, as some researchers call it. Back then, with sea levels far lower, much of that ancient shoreline is now drowned, lying under hundreds of feet of water. The campsites, the canoes, the middens, they'd all be out there, hidden beneath the waves. Very hard to find, very easy to miss. Another possibility is more complex routes, inland refuges where the ice thinned, brief openings along river valleys, corridors that appeared for a few centuries and then closed again, a messy patchwork journey rather than a single grand migration. White Sands doesn't tell us which path they took. The footprints don't point toward Beringia or toward the Pacific. They just go along the lake, back and forth, the way you might walk along a familiar shoreline today. But their age, if confirmed, forces us to think in new ways. The ice wasn't a simple closed door followed by an open door. The Americas weren't empty, then suddenly full. Instead, there may have been earlier explorations, quiet colonizations, small groups slipping through windows of opportunity during a chaotic climate, like those meta-population games your ancestors once played in Africa, groups rising and falling, some going extinct, others surviving, leaving faint genetic and archaeological traces scattered across continents. Of course, not everyone is convinced by the dates. Since the 2021 announcement, there's been a lively debate. Some researchers argue that the radiocarbon dates on the plant seeds could be off. Maybe the plants used old carbon dissolved in the lake water, making them look older than they really are, like a clock set a bit too far back. Others point out that when you're working the far back in time, small contamination issues can have big effects. A tiny bit of older carbon mixed in with younger material can nudge the dates farther into the past. In response, the White Sands team has been running additional tests, different dating methods, more samples, independent checks. Some follow-up studies have supported the older ages, others have suggested slightly younger dates but still pre-Clovis, still older than that neat 13,500-year timeline once taught as fact. For now, the consensus is cautious. The footprints are clearly ancient. Almost everyone agrees they're older than the classic Clovis horizon. Whether they're 21,000 to 23,000 years old, or 19,000, or somewhere around there, is still under active investigation. New data keeps coming in. Papers are published, critiqued, defended. Science, in other words, is doing what it does best, poking, testing, trying to break its own favourite ideas to see what's left standing. But whatever the final number on the radiocarbon chart, the deep significance of White Sands doesn't depend entirely on a single date. Those ghostly tracks have already changed the way we think about deep American prehistory. They anchor the first Americans in a very specific, very human moment. not as faceless migrants marching across maps with arrows above their heads, but as actual people. A teenager walking faster than they probably should along a muddy shoreline. Children playing at the lake edge while mammoths graze in the distance. Someone pausing to look back, then stepping forward again, leaving a print where the heel sinks a little deeper, as if they hesitated for half a heartbeat. For most of our species' story, the record is cold, stone, bone, ash, durable things that survive the grinding of time. White sands is different. It's warm. It's soft. It's the texture of skin against mud, preserved by accident, then revealed by wind and water cycles, disappearing and reappearing like a memory you keep almost forgetting. It reminds us that deep time isn't just about dates and diagrams. It's about individuals. Someone with sore feet at the end of the day. Someone annoyed that they have to carry the youngest again. Someone laughing as they race through the shallows, unaware that each splash is writing their existence into the future. When you zoom out, the footprints are part of a huge tangled story, about ice sheets and corridors and coastal routes, about Neanderthals and Denisovans and modern humans mixing and migrating. But when you zoom in, they're just steps, one after another, across a damp lakeshore in a world that no longer exists. And yet, when you trace them with your eyes, following that long line of prints across the gypsum flats, you're doing something the original trackmaker could never have imagined. You're walking with them, from 23,000 years in the future, side by side across the darkness of time. The story of the first Americans isn't just written in stone tools and footprints, it's written inside you. Every cell in your body carries tiny molecular records, quiet little journals that have been copying themselves for hundreds of thousands of years. For most of human history, nobody could read them. Then, in the last few decades, we learned how to listen. And when scientists finally cracked open those microscopic archives, they discovered something both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The past we thought we knew was only a draft. Tonight, we're going to let the genetic detectives take over. Not the kind with magnifying glasses and trench coats, but the kind who sit in climate-controlled labs, coaxing fragments of DNA out of ancient bones, teeth, and even the sediment beneath old campfires. They work with tweezers and pipettes, whispering to molecules that haven't spoken in tens of thousands of years. And slowly those molecules have started to talk. For a long time, the story of the peopling of the Americas was told almost entirely by archaeologists. Stone tools, hearths, butchered bones, the occasional footprint trackway. But archaeology has limits. Sites erode, coastlines sink beneath the sea, organic materials vanish. Most of what ever happened leaves no trace we can see. DNA is different. It rides the unbroken chain of life. Ancient DNA analysis has become a kind of time machine, not a flashy cinematic one, a fragile, partial, frustrating one. Most ancient DNA is damaged, shredded by heat, moisture, and time. But in the right conditions, cold caves, permafrost, the dense interior of a tooth, fragments survive. When scientists sequence those fragments and compare them to modern genomes, patterns emerge. Hidden relationships, lost migrations, whole populations that archaeology barely hints at. This is how we learned that Neanderthals and Denisovans were not just our distant cousins, but our occasional partners. Their DNA lingers in our blood, like faint echoes of an ancient conversation. And the same logic that revealed those old encounters has now been turned toward the biggest question of all. Who were the first people to reach the Americas? For a long time, the answer seemed simple. Modern Native Americans, we were told, descended from a single wave of people from Siberia, crossing Beringia at the end of the last ice age. Clean, linear, easy to diagram in a textbook. Then came the DNA, when geneticists began analyzing the genomes of indigenous peoples from North and South America, carefully, and only with community consent in more recent work, they kept seeing the same thing. a very strong signal pointing back to Northeast Asia, to ancient Siberia. This part of the story is now one of the most solid pieces of the puzzle. Across the Americas, from the Arctic to Patagonia, Native American populations share a core ancestry that branches off from ancient Siberian groups in the distant past. Not yesterday, not 10,000 years ago, but much earlier, on the order of 20,000+ years, maybe more, depending on the model. It's as if a small, isolated group split from their Siberian relatives, disappeared into a long corridor of time and space, and then reappeared on the American side of the world. Some geneticists think this ghost period corresponds to a population living in Beringia itself, the lost land bridge between Asia and North America, trapped by glaciers to the east and west, yet surrounded by surprisingly rich ecosystems. These people may have waited out the height of the last ice age on a steppe of grasses, dwarf shrubs, and roaming megafauna. Their DNA carries marks of that long isolation, reduced diversity, distinctive mutations, subtle patterns that whisper of a population squeezed, then released. When the ice finally retreated, their descendants poured south into the empty continents. Their genetic signature spread like spilled ink across two vast landmasses. But that's only the beginning of what DNA has to say, because when scientists started looking more closely, they noticed something odd. Most Native American ancestry traces back to that ancient Siberian Beringian branch, but in some indigenous groups, especially in parts of Amazonia, there was a faint signal that didn't quite fit. A subtle statistical nudge, almost like background noise, that kept showing up in comparison after comparison. When they tried to explain it, their models pointed to a strange conclusion. A small portion of ancestry in some South American populations seemed more closely related, very distantly, to peoples in Australasia, Australia, Papua New Guinea, some groups in Melanesia, than to other Asians. Not a direct link, not recent. Not anything like Australians sailed to Brazil. More like a shared, very ancient branch on the family tree that somehow lingered here and there in the Americas. Geneticists, being human, gave this mysterious signal a name, Population Y. The Y stands for Wipiquera, a word meaning ancestor in the Tupi language family. It's not a tribe, not a culture we can point to on a map. It's a ghost. A hypothetical ancestral population that contributed a small amount of DNA to some early South Americans, then seemingly vanished. How did that happen? There are competing ideas. One possibility is that the ancestors of Native Americans back in East Asia were already a blend of multiple ancient lineages, some closer to modern Northeast Asians, some closer to these Australasian-like groups. When a small Beringian founding population crossed into the Americas, they carried a bit of this deeper diversity with them. Over time, most of those signals were either lost or swamped, but in some regions, like parts of the Amazon, they persisted at slightly higher levels. Another possibility is more dramatic. Maybe there was an early, poorly understood migration into the Americas by people with a different ancestry profile, and later waves mixed with them. If so, their archaeological traces might be buried along coasts now drowned by rising seas, or scattered in sites we haven't recognized yet. Right now, the evidence leans toward complex population structure in Asia, before the crossing, rather than long-distance Australasian voyages across the Pacific. But that could change. New genomes, new methods, new surprises. Population Y is a reminder that DNA doesn't always give us neat answers. Sometimes it just points a trembling finger at a door we didn't know existed, and leaves it slightly ajar. The surprises don't end in the Amazon. Some Native American groups show genetic affinities to ancient populations in what is now Japan, especially to the Jomon people, who lived on the islands for thousands of years before the arrival of later agricultural groups. Again, these are not direct, simple links, but faint echoes in the data. They suggest that the broader region around the North Pacific, the Pacific Rim stretching from Japan through coastal Siberia, across Beringia, and down the Americas, may have been crisscrossed by complex networks of related peoples long before the last glacial maximum ended. In a world of giant ice sheets and lowered sea levels, the coastlines looked different. Islands were larger or connected. Sheltered bays and kelp forests lined the shores, rich in fish and marine mammals. Some researchers propose a kelp highway, used by early maritime peoples skirting the southern edge of the ice. If that's true, then the genetic hints of connection between Japan, Siberia, and the Americas might reflect an ancient ring-shaped world of coastal cultures we can barely see now. Their camps drowned, their canoes rotted, their stories lost, except for whispers written in our genomes. To untangle these threads, geneticists often turn to a special kind of DNA, not the big, mixed-up chromosomes you inherit from both parents, but tiny circular molecules that sit inside your cell's power plants, the mitochondria. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost entirely from your mother. It doesn't recombine like regular DNA, so its history is simpler to trace. Over time, small mutations accumulate. Patterns of these mutations form lineages, haplogroups, that can be followed through space and time like family names. In the Americas, most indigenous mitochondrial lineages fall into just a few major groups, labeled with letters like A, B, C, D, and X, 2A. They're not random, they cluster in ways that tell a story. Those haplogroups trace back to ancestral branches in Asia, but they also show signs of a bottleneck, a relatively small number of maternal lines founding the entire Native American population. How small? It's hard to say precisely, but we're not talking about millions of mothers crossing into the Americas. We're talking about a much more limited number, multiplied over thousands of years. Some haplogroups are more common in North America, others in South America. Some appear concentrated along coasts, others inland. A few, like X2A, sparked intense debate because their closest relatives in the Old World are not in Siberia, but in Western Eurasia. For a while, that led to bizarre claims about ancient European migrations. But as more data came in, the picture settled into something less sensational and more subtle. X2A is its own deeply ancient branch, likely part of the same broad Northeast Asian tapestry as the others, just rarer and more complicated to trace. Mitochondrial DNA doesn't give us exact dates or specific roots. It doesn't show us faces or languages, but it does tell us that the founding populations of the Americas were not enormous, and that once here, they spread and diversified rapidly, carrying a handful of maternal lineages into every valley, every river basin, every coastal plain. Every person alive today with indigenous ancestry in the Americas carries one of those lines, unbroken, back to a small number of women standing on the edge of an unknown world. All of this, the Siberian lynx, the population Y ghost, the mitochondrial lineages, is scientifically thrilling. But it comes with weight. Genetic studies of indigenous peoples are not just academic puzzles. They involve real communities with their own histories, beliefs, and sovereign rights. For much of the 20th century, researchers treated indigenous bodies and remains as resources to be collected, measured, sampled, and stored, often without consent, often with little benefit to the people themselves. That legacy casts a long shadow. Today, ethical work in this field requires something that earlier generations of scientists often ignored: genuine partnership. Many indigenous communities insist on controlling how their DNA is used, who can access it, and what questions are even appropriate to ask. Some have chosen not to participate in genetic studies at all, viewing them as intrusive or misaligned with their own origin stories. Others have engaged on their own terms, using genetics as one tool among many to explore questions they care about. migrations, clan histories, connections between distant groups. In some cases, community-led projects have rewritten earlier narratives imposed from the outside. Genetics can never replace oral traditions, spiritual understandings, or cultural memory. It isn't more true than those things. It's just different. A biological perspective that can sometimes complement, sometimes challenge, sometimes sit uneasily beside other ways of knowing. The most careful researchers now emphasize this. DNA doesn't tell the real story of a people. It tells a particular kind of story about molecules and lineages and probabilities. Interpreting that story ethically means listening to the people whose DNA is being studied and accepting that not all questions are ours to ask. In the end, genetics doesn't hand us a tidy answer to who the first Americans were. It complicates the picture. On one hand, it strongly supports some archaeological conclusions. Yes, there is a deep ancestral link between Native Americans and ancient Siberians. Yes, there was likely a Beringian standstill, a period of isolation before the spread into the continents. Yes, the founding populations were relatively small. On the other hand, it raises new questions and tensions. If human footprints at White Sands really are older than 20,000 years, how do they fit with the timelines inferred from DNA? Did an earlier wave of humans enter the Americas and leave few or no descendants in modern populations? Are we missing ancient lineages that once existed but were erased by later expansions, diseases, or chance? Genetics is probabilistic. It can say, given the DNA we see today, the most likely scenario is this. But it can't easily see populations that left no living descendants. Those people might have been here. They might have thrived for thousands of years, and then through a cruel mix of bad luck and bad timing, their genetic legacy simply evaporated. Archaeology might still find them, or not. For now we're left with a layered story. A core ancestry rooted in ancient Siberia and Beringia. Possible traces of deeper, more complex Asian structure. Ghost signals like population Y hinting at lost branches. Coastal connections reaching toward Japan and the broader Pacific Rim. A handful of maternal lineages radiating across 2 continents. Beneath it all, the humbling realization that our tools, stone, bone, DNA, statistics, can only grasp so much of what really happened. The first Americans, whoever they were not just data points on a graph. They were living, breathing people with fears, desires, rivalries, and songs. They watched the ice retreat. They learned new plants and animals. They navigated rivers whose names are long forgotten. They told stories at night about where they had come from and where they hoped their children might go. Their words are gone. Their camps are mostly dust. But in a quiet, molecular way, their journey continues, inside us, written in code, waiting to be read. And as we follow those faint genetic trails deeper into the past, another question begins to rise, gentle but insistent. What if some of the first footsteps in the Americas didn't belong to us at all? To answer that, we have to leave the microscopes behind and look again at the sea and the forgotten technologies that might have carried strangers to these shores long before our own ancestors arrived. Now drift with me to a shoreline you'll never see on a postcard. No cities, no harbours, no lighthouses, just a line where land dissolves into water and a small group of ancient humans staring out across the waves at something they can't quite see, but somehow know is there. For a long time, archaeologists imagined our distant ancestors hugging the coast nervously, afraid of deep water, moving only when the land let them. The story went like this. We were walkers, not sailors. Boat came late. Navigation came later. Oceans were walls. But the evidence is quietly, stubbornly, telling a different story. Because some of the very first places humans reached were islands you can't walk to. Take Indonesia and the ancient islands of Wallacea. even at the lowest sea levels of the ice ages, even when so much water was locked up in glaciers that shorelines stretched miles further out, there were still deep channels of ocean separating those islands from the Asian mainland. No land bridges, no convenient sandbars. Yet by at least 50,000 years ago, and probably earlier, humans were living there. They had to cross open water to get in. Not just one accidental log ride. Multiple crossings, enough times by enough people to establish stable populations. That doesn't happen by wandering into the surf by mistake. That's planning. That's technology. That's somebody looking at a tree trunk or a bundle of reeds or the hollow shell of a giant log and thinking, this can float me to another world. And then there's Australia. The colonization of Sahul, the ancient supercontinent made of Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, is one of the clearest proofs that deep in the past, long before recorded history, humans were already ocean crossers. We know from multiple lines of evidence, stone tools, charcoal from ancient fires, bones with cut marks, that humans were in Australia at least 65,000 years ago. Some researchers even argue for slightly earlier dates. But even if we take the most conservative estimates, the conclusion is the same. Australia was never connected to Asia by dry land during the time modern humans existed. At low sea level, the distances were smaller, the island chains closer together, but there was always open ocean between the last Asian island and the first bit of Sahul. To get there, our ancestors had to build something that floated, put people and supplies on it, push off from a familiar shore, and keep going until the land behind them disappeared. They had to navigate currents, they had to deal with storms, they had to arrive in a place with completely new plants, new animals, new dangers, and somehow survive. And they didn't just do it once. Genetic evidence suggests that the founding population of Australia was not a single family drifting in by accident, but a deliberate, repeated migration, maybe hundreds of people over multiple voyages. You don't get that from clinging to driftwood in panic. You get that from communities who understand water, who know how to lash logs together, how to hollow a canoe, how to read stars and swells and wind. All of that 65,000 years ago. By comparison, the Egyptian pyramids were built yesterday, and if ancient humans could cross the seas between Asia and Sahul, what else could they do? How far could they go? How many coastlines did they explore that are now hundreds of feet underwater, erased by the slow, patient rise of post-Ice Age seas? This is where the story of lost technologies begins to blur with the story of forgotten voyages. Because once you accept that people 65,000 years ago were capable of planned ocean crossings, the idea of other long journeys stops feeling impossible. It starts feeling inevitable. That's where some of the more speculative theories enter the picture. You might have heard of the Solitarian hypothesis. It's one of the most controversial ideas in American prehistory. The basic claim is simple but dramatic, that a group of Stone Age Europeans belonging to the Solutrean culture in what is now France and Spain might have reached North America across the North Atlantic during the last Ice Age, long before the ancestors of modern Native Americans arrived via Beringia. The argument goes like this. Solutrean stone tools made around 22,000 to 17,000 years ago have a distinctive style, beautifully thinned, bifacial spear points that look a bit like later Clovis points found in North America. Add to that the fact that during the peak of the Ice Age, vast sheets of ice extended across the North Atlantic, creating seasonal belts of pack ice between Europe and North America. Some proponents imagine Solutrean hunters travelling along the ice edge, using simple boats, maybe following seals and seabirds, inching their way west over generations. It's a striking picture, a haunting one, small groups in skin boats, paddling along blue-black water, ice cliffs towering beside them, the cries of seabirds overhead, the unknown continent waiting thousands of miles away. but almost all mainstream archaeologists reject the Solutrean hypothesis. The similarities in stone tools, they say, are superficial. There's no secure genetic link between Solutrean Europeans and ancient Native Americans. The dates don't line up cleanly. And crucially, there's no solid archaeological evidence of Solutrean-level technology in the right places and times along that proposed route. So as it stands, the Solutrean hypothesis is considered fringe, a fascinating what-if, but not supported by the data we have. Still, the idea persists for a reason. It taps into a deeper intuition, that oceans are not always barriers. Sometimes they are highways. Other speculative ideas argue for ancient trans-Pacific contacts, petroglyphs that look vaguely similar on opposite sides of the ocean, puzzling botanical distributions, intriguing but ambiguous hints that perhaps, at some point in the deep or not-so-deep past, people from Asia or even from Oceania might have reached the Americas by island hopping, coastal sailing, or even longer blue water voyages. Mainstream science does accept some pre-Columbian trans-Pacific contact, like the likely movement of the sweet potato from South America to Polynesia, probably more than 1,000 years ago. But when we start talking about much earlier crossings, during glacial periods or tens of thousands of years before present, the evidence gets very thin, and most researchers remain skeptical. Still, just because an idea is fringe doesn't mean it's worthless. It marks the edge of what we can currently test. It reminds us how little of the ancient coastline we've actually explored, and that brings us to one of the most important and most humbling concepts in archaeology: taphonomic bias. Taphonomy is the study of what happens to things after they die, or after they're abandoned. Bones, tools, campsites, entire villages. How they decay, how they break, how they get buried, or erased. When you look at the archaeological record, you're not seeing everything that was. You're seeing the tiny fraction that survived the merciless filters of time, erosion, scavengers, chemical decay, shifting rivers, landslides, volcanic eruptions, ice advances, and for anything near the ocean, the slow march of rising seas. During the last ice age, sea levels were up to about 120 meters lower than today. That means enormous coastal plains, places where people would have lived, hunted, built camps, maybe even harbours and boat sheds, are now underwater, far beyond the reach of casual investigation. If early seafaring cultures existed along those paleo coastlines, their canoes, their fish traps, their wooden piers and woven sails, their bone harpoons and carved paddles, almost all of that would be gone. Organic materials rarely survive tens of thousands of years on exposed coasts, and when you add submersion under salt water, the odds plummet. So when we say we have no evidence of advanced seafaring before X date, we have to remember what we're really saying is we have almost no surviving evidence from the exact environments where early seafaring people would have left their stuff. It's like judging the history of aviation by what remains in a world where every airport, runway and hangar was built on floating platforms, and then all the oceans rose and swallowed them. The absence of evidence in such a skewed record is not evidence of absence. It's a reminder that nature is an editor, and a ruthless one. This is where the improbability argument comes in. When we think about someone crossing an ocean in a small prehistoric boat, our brains instinctively recoil. That sounds impossible. The dangers seem overwhelming. The chances of success look tiny, and on the scale of a single voyage, or a single human lifetime, they often were. If you put one small group in a flimsy raft and push them into the Pacific at random, they probably die. But evolution, culture, and migration don't work with one roll of the dice. They work with millions. Imagine a stretch of coast where people have lived for 10,000 years. Every generation, a few individuals are more curious about the horizon. They take small trips along shore. They learn where the currents run. They figure out which wind patterns are safe, which are deadly. They watch birds disappear over the horizon at the same angle every evening and come back at dawn, bellies full of fish. Most trips are short, some are longer. Once in a very long while, someone goes too far, or the wind doesn't shift when it usually does, or a storm pushes them into a current they didn't know existed, and they see land where no one they know has ever been. Over tens of thousands of years, with countless coasts, countless storms, countless curious people, very low probability events stop being unimaginable. They become almost guaranteed. It only takes one successful landfall, one sheltered bay with fresh water and edible plants, one small group that survives long enough to raise children who grow up thinking, this new place is home. When you stretch time out over millennia and multiply the number of attempts, the improbable starts to look inevitable. So when we look at the peopling of the Americas and we see multiple pulses of migration, some perhaps hugging coastlines, some crossing interior ice-free corridors, maybe even some coastal movements we haven't found yet, we shouldn't be surprised. The tools for short-distance seafaring existed at least 65,000 years ago. The curiosity and ingenuity that built those first boats, that was baked into us much earlier. Does that mean there were fleets of ships in the Pleistocene, crisscrossing the Pacific like a prehistoric shipping lane? Probably not. That's where we slide from reasonable inference into fantasy. But could there have been rare, scattered long-distance voyages, accidental or intentional, that left almost no trace in the archaeological record? Voyages that ended on sinking coasts or in storms, or in assimilated tiny populations that vanished genetically under later waves. That's harder to dismiss. This is the humbling part. When we talk about lost technologies, we don't just mean gadgets or tools. We mean entire traditions of craft and knowledge that can thread through dozens of generations and then vanish without a fossil, without a ruin, without a word. The first people to cross to Seoul knew how to build watercraft capable of carrying families, food and fire. They could read the ocean well enough to find islands beyond the horizon. They knew which trees made the best hulls, which fibres made the strongest ropes, which resins sealed the seams. All of that could have taken hundreds or thousands of years to develop. Then, once those people spread inland and adapted to new environments, the old knowledge might have become less important. Boats rot, ropes decay. The last elder who really understood the old building techniques dies, and the ocean, once a road, becomes a distant border again. 10,000 years later, no one would know there had ever been sailors there at all. As you lie here listening, it's strange to realize how much of human history has dissolved like that. Not just voyages across seas, but songs, myths, hunting tricks, medicinal plants, ways of napping stone, ways of tracking birds, the particular way firelight reflected off the hull of a canoe at dusk on some forgotten shore. When we dig in the ground, or scan the seafloor, or analyze ancient DNA, we're catching the faintest echoes of those worlds, enough to prove that extraordinary things happened, not enough to know exactly how. The story of the first Americans, who they were, how they moved, what they knew, sits right at that boundary between evidence and possibility. We see enough to be sure that some of them were better sailors, better navigators, more imaginative engineers than we once believed. We also see the vast silent spaces where time has erased almost everything they left behind. Somewhere between those shorelines, between what we can prove and what we can only infer, the forgotten voyages sleep, and the further we look back, the more it becomes clear. We are not the first clever humans to stand on a beach, stare at the horizon, and wonder what lies beyond it. We are only the ones who forgot how many times that question was already answered. So where does all of this leave us? You've heard about mammoth bones broken in strange ways, footprints crossing ancient lake beds, DNA whispering about lost populations, and tools that don't quite fit into any tidy timeline. It can feel like a mess, like a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and someone might have switched the box lid. But if you step back, squint a little, and let your mind drift, a picture does begin to emerge. Not a single straight arrow of people marching from Siberia to New Mexico in one heroic wave. Something slower, stranger, more tangled. It looks less like a single migration and more like a web. The most cautious version of the story, the one many archaeologists would sign their names to today, goes something like this. Around 20,000 to 25,000 years ago, there were people living in northeastern Asia, in that cold, wind-scraped land that's now partly under the Bering Strait. They were not a single tribe, but many small groups, moving with the seasons, following animals, gathering plants, watching the ice. Some of them drifted east into Beringia when sea levels fell, turning the ocean floor into a vast, grassy subarctic steppe. They lived there for thousands of years, isolated from their relatives in Asia. Their DNA began to drift. Their languages changed. They told stories about the spirits of the ice and the long, low sun that never climbed quite high in the sky. Then, as the ice sheets began to melt and retreat, corridors opened. Not one neat hallway, but shifting landscapes of tundra, river valleys, coastal refuges. People moved south, not in a single rush, but in pulses and trickles. Small groups probing forward, others hanging back, some turning around and disappearing into the archaeological dark. By around 16,000 years ago, there were humans living south of the great ice sheets, leaving traces on the Pacific coast, in caves, along rivers that would later carve out the heart of the continent. By 14,000 years ago, there were people in the interior. By 13,000 years ago, Clovis hunters were napping their exquisite spear points and chasing mammoths on the Great Plains. This is the backbone of the current consensus, an early presence at least 16,000 years ago, probably by people using some kind of coastal or ice edge routes, followed by later waves using interior corridors, and then the Clovis expansions spreading technology rather than founding the very first population. But wrapped around this cautious spine are a lot of loose threads, sites like White Sands, with their possible 20 to 23,000-year-old footprints, sites like Monteverde in Chile, which may push human presence well past 14,000 years, scattered hints from Brazil, Mexico, the eastern United States, suggesting that the story might go deeper in time, maybe much deeper. Most researchers would tell you something real is there. Humans in the Americas before Clovis, definitely. Maybe 1,000 years earlier, maybe 3,000 years, possibly for the more daring 10,000 or more. Almost no one will confidently say 130,000 years yet. But almost everyone now admits that our old picture was too simple, too recent, too tidy. Instead of a single migration, we're looking at multiple waves, multiple attempts. People coming in at different times, along different routes, maybe even from different starting populations in Asia. Some lineages thrived. Others fizzled out, leaving only a handful of stone flakes or a single scrap of DNA in a modern genome. If you could watch it from above, sped up like a time-lapse, you wouldn't see one clean arrow. You'd see flickers, little lights blinking on and off across the continents, camps flaring into existence, smoke rising from hearths, people laughing, arguing, telling stories, then fading away again. Other lights turning on elsewhere, further south, further inland, moving up rivers, hugging coasts, climbing mountains. Generations upon generations, most of them utterly forgotten. This is why the question, who were the first Americans, might not have a single answer. It's tempting to imagine a single foundational moment, a brave band crossing a land bridge, setting foot on a new continent, planting a metaphorical flag and becoming the first. But evolution and culture and migration don't work that way. First, in what sense? The first people to set foot on Beringian soil when it was still attached to Asia? the first people to cross south of the ice sheets and live where the great prairies would one day be, the first people whose DNA survives in living indigenous communities today, the first people to leave behind artifacts that we can still recognize with confidence as human. Each of those questions might point to a different group, at a different time, in a different place. Some early migrations may have been demographic dead ends, whole populations that left no known descendants. They would still have been first in a chronological sense, but their line ended. Their names, their stories, their languages vanished when the last child of the last group died, somewhere under a sky that looked a lot like ours. Other groups came later, but they're the ones whose descendants are here now, whose genetic signatures run through modern indigenous peoples from the Arctic to Patagonia. For them, first is not about the earliest footprint in the sand, but about continuity, an unbroken line of living memory carried in bodies, in stories, in ceremonies. And then there's another layer entirely, because when archaeologists ask, who are the first Americans, they're using the word American in a purely geographic sense, humans in the Americas. But from the perspective of many indigenous nations, the story of origins isn't about crossing bridges and following herds. It's about emerging from the land itself, being placed there, growing out of it, belonging to it in a way that doesn't map neatly onto Ice Age maps and radiocarbon dates. For a long time, Western scientists dismissed these oral traditions as myths in the dismissive sense, stories without truth. Now, that attitude is changing, slowly and not perfectly, but changing. Researchers have started to notice something curious. In some cases, indigenous oral histories preserve memories that seem to line up with geological or archaeological evidence. Stories about great floods that match the timing of glacial lake outbursts, stories about coastlines that used to be further out, or islands that sank that line up suspiciously well with sea level changes at the end of the last ice age. Stories that remember animals long extinct like giant ground sloths or mammoths, described with a level of detail that feels less like fantasy and more like distant ancestral memory. No one can prove that a specific story maps onto a specific event. Oral traditions shift and grow and intertwine over thousands of years. But the fact that these alignments exist at all suggests something important. People have been here long enough and paying close enough attention to weave actual land memory into their narratives. From that perspective, the scientific question of who was first may be less important than the indigenous emphasis on relationship. Who is of this place, whose ancestors walk these valleys so long that human presence itself becomes part of the landscape? And as new technologies sharpen our scientific eyes, that sense of deep time only gets stronger. Right now, as you lie there listening, there are teams in labs and on dig sites quietly, patiently chipping away at this mystery. Archaeologists on their knees, brushing away thin layers of soil with soft brushes and dental tools. Geologists taking cores from ancient lake beds. Paleogeneticists in clean rooms, hunched over fragments of bone and tooth, coaxing whisper-thin strands of DNA out of porous mineral. They're using tools that didn't exist even a decade ago. High-precision radiocarbon dating that can catch tiny contamination errors. Luminescence dating that measures when a grain of sand last saw sunlight. Software that can simulate ancient coastlines and river networks based on changing sea levels and ice sheets. Machine learning algorithms that hunt for faint patterns in genetic data, teasing out signals of ancient population splits and ghost lineages that no longer exist. Underwater archaeologists are starting to explore the continental shelves off the Pacific Northwest and eastern Canada, places that were dry land during the Ice Age. LiDAR scanners mounted on airplanes and drones are stripping away forests in virtual space, revealing buried earthworks and ancient roads across the Amazon, the Mississippi Valley, the Yucatan. Places that were dismissed as empty are turning out to be thick with human fingerprints. Each new method nudges the timeline, redraws the maps, blurs and then sharpens our picture of who was here, how long ago, and how they lived. Maybe in 10 years, or 50, we'll have a clearer answer. Maybe submerged sites on the old Beringian coastline will be found, with campfires and tools still in place under the silt. Maybe a child's tooth from 25,000 years ago will yield a complete genome showing a lineage we never knew existed. Maybe we'll find unequivocal evidence for humans deep in the last glacial maximum, or even earlier. Or maybe the picture will stay fuzzy at the edges, always just a little out of reach, like a dream you almost remember when you wake up, but not quite. Because behind all the dates and tools and DNA, this is really about people, not the abstractions, populations, migrations, lineages, but individual human lives. A young woman standing at the edge of a glacier-fed river on the Beringian steppe, watching the sky glow pink behind distant ice. Her hands are sore from scraping hides, but she's learned a new knot from an elder today, a better way to lash bone to wood. She feels a quiet satisfaction, knowing she'll teach it to her little brother tonight by the fire. An old man in what's now central Mexico, 15,000 years ago, teaching a child to flake obsidian just so, striking with the right angle, the right force. He remembers his own grandfather's hands on his guiding the hammer stone. The technique is older than any living person he knows, but he doesn't think of it that way. To him, it's just the right way to do it. A small group of people crossing a coastal headland somewhere in what will later be called British Columbia. The sea is lower, the shoreline jagged with kelp forests and tidal flats. They carry baskets, children, memories of places behind them, hopes for places ahead. They don't draw a line and say, now we're in a new world. The world to them has always been one continuous thing, whatever shape the ice happens to carve. Someone, somewhere on the high plains, standing over the fresh tracks of a huge animal they've never seen before, a mastodon, a giant bison. Their heart speeds up. Fear, awe, opportunity, all mixing together. They call back to the others, voice thin against the wind. None of them knows they're early. None of them is thinking, we are the first Americans. They're just people. Hungry, curious, tired, in love, annoyed, determined, living their lives as completely and fully as you are living yours right now. When we look back on them from a distance of 15,000 or 20,000 years, it's tempting to turn them into symbols, pioneers, colonizers, victims, heroes. But the real wonder lies in something quieter. They were here, on these same continents, under the same stars, breathing the same air molecules that you're breathing now, separated only by a long river of time. They watch the Milky Way arch overhead, just as you can. They listen to waves on the shore, wind in the grass, the crackle of a fire. They stared into the darkness at night and wondered what was out there. Spirits, animals, other people, the future. When you stretch your imagination back to them, you're doing something that's uniquely human. You're folding time, connecting yourself to people you'll never meet, in places you may never see. You're participating in the same deep capacity for storytelling and curiosity that helped our ancestors survive ice ages, cross oceans and remake entire continents. In the end, maybe the exact date of the very first footprint doesn't matter as much as we think. What matters is that by the time history starts to write itself in stone and bone, people are already woven into these landscapes. They've already turned foreign into familiar, new into home. They have already built relationships with animals, with rivers, with mountains, with each other, that will echo through tens of thousands of years into the present. You are part of that echo. Every question you ask about the past, every moment you spend imagining these earlier worlds, is another thread connecting you back to them. It's a reminder that human history isn't a line that starts and ends with us, but a vast tapestry of lives stacked layer upon layer beneath our feet. Somewhere in that tapestry are the ones we call first, but around them, above them, and flowing out from them are countless others, their children and their children's children, all the way to now. All of us, in the end, are just brief flickers of awareness in a very old universe, linked across deep time by memory, by genes, by stories, and by the simple, stubborn fact that we keep walking forward into unknown lands, and then turning around to ask, who was here before us, and what did it feel like to be them? So now, here we are, back in the present, lying in bed, phone glowing softly, listening to stories about people and almost people who walked this planet tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years before anyone we'd recognize as us stepped onto American soil. We started with certainty, with tidy textbook timelines and bold, simple statements. Clovis were the first, 13,000 years ago. End of story. It felt clean, safe, easy to memorize. One migration, one technology, one neat line across the map. But the ground beneath that certainty cracked. As we went deeper, the neat story started to fray. Ancient campsites that seemed too old, tools that didn't fit the pattern, bones that looked like they'd been deliberately broken long before Clovis hunters were supposed to exist. Footprints walking across white sands while mammoths still lived. Mastodon bones at Cerutti that seemed to carry the scars of a mind at work, not just the blind pressure of ice and time. Piece by piece, the timeline blurred, the cast of characters expanded, and the question quietly shifted from when did we first get here to who was here, and how many times did the story start and restart before it finally landed on us. Maybe some of those early travellers were members of our own species, early waves that came, survived for a while and then vanished, leaving only scattered hints in bones and sediments and DNA. Maybe others were cousins, like Neanderthals or Denisovans, or some unknown branch we haven't named yet. People who thought and planned and suffered and laughed, but who would not have called themselves human in any language we know, because our language didn't exist yet. Whoever they were, they all shared one thing. They moved, across ice, across tundra, along exposed coasts and vanished land bridges, across Beringia when it was a world of grass and rivers, along shorelines that are now drowned beneath cold, silent water. They followed herds and seasons and distant smoke on the horizon. They walked into unknown spaces with no maps, no guarantees, no second chances if they guessed wrong about the weather or the river or the animals ahead. And that wandering, that quiet, stubborn urge to see what's over the next ridge, that part is still with you. Every modern human alive today carries the legacy of those earlier travellers, even if we're not sure exactly who they were. The same nervous system that kept a small band alive on a windy ridge in Ice Age Alaska is the one that lets you feel the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket, the slow drift of your breathing right now. The same curiosity that drove them to follow mammoth tracks across frozen valleys is what makes you press play on a video about ancient mysteries when you should probably already be asleep. The deep past can feel alien. Non-human species, unfamiliar tools, continents in different shapes, sea levels far from what we know. But the more we learn, the more familiar it becomes. A child's footprint set beside a larger one, a campfire ring with cracked stone from heating and cooling, a worked flake of stone that fits perfectly in the hand, sharpened along one smooth, deliberate edge. You may never know their names. They probably didn't have names that would make sense to us anyway. But in a strange way, they're still your people, your extended family, stretched backward not just through centuries, but through entire ice ages. And there's a kind of comfort in that. We are not the first to live through uncertainty, not the first to face changing climates, shifting coastlines, disappearing animals, strange new arrivals. Again and again, across deep time, humans and almost humans have adapted, migrated, reimagined how to live on this planet. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes entire lineages ended. But enough of them survived, learned, and passed something on that you exist, here, now, listening. As your eyes get heavier and your thoughts start to drift, you can let that be a quiet reassurance. Exploration and survival are not new things we're trying to figure out. They are ancient habits, written into us by millions of footsteps on forgotten ground. If you enjoy drifting through this deep time journey, you can gently tap like or subscribe so you don't miss the next story we uncover together. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. And if you feel like sharing a small piece of your own story, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. A city, a countryside, a ship at sea, a tiny apartment, a dorm room. Scattered points of light across the modern world, echoing those scattered campsites of the past. If you'd like to support this channel a little more, there's also the option to join as a member here on YouTube. That's completely optional, only if it feels right for you. Just being here, listening, is already more than enough. For now, let the mammoths and mastodons fade into the dark. Let the ancient shorelines sink beneath an imagined sea. Picture those first travellers, whoever they were, watching unfamiliar stars rise over a new horizon, then lying down beside a fading fire, listening to the night. May your own dreams take you walking beside them for a while, across empty beaches and quiet grasslands, under skies untouched by city lights. Rest well, drift slowly, and let the long, gentle river of deep time carry you into sleep